Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Food and Beverage Regulatory and Litigation Update Halloween edition. I'm Trent Taylor, and I am so pleased that you are able to join us for this. As y'all probably know, we have been on hiatus. It's been a while since we have done one of these. Things have been super busy, but we couldn't let Halloween pass by without doing our annual Halloween webinar. One introductory note, a lot has happened since our last webinar, which was done exactly 1 year ago today. We decided not to try to cover everything that has happened since then. That could be a day long or maybe even a week long webinar. Instead, we've tried to focus on the past few months, and we have included even some developments that happened in the last few days. So we're going to be covering and trying to focus on that today. So here's our panelists that will be presenting today. So really a fantastic group. Katie Barber there in the middle is a partner and is a co-leader of our firm's Appeals and Issues Practice Group. She clerked for Justice Ginsburg on the U.S. Supreme Court, and we're very pleased that she is able to join us to give us a short preview of some key cases pending before the U.S. Supreme Court. And this is, I think, maybe the third year in a row that she's done it for us. And so we're making it an annual tradition, and we very much appreciate her time. We also have Royce Dubonnet, who's a partner in our Chicago office and one of the most knowledgeable lawyers I know inside and outside the firm on food and beverage litigation and regulatory issues. And he's also co-lead of the cannabis, hemp, and CBD industry team. So really pleased that Royce can join us again. He's been a mainstay of these webinars. We also have Frank Talbot, who's an associate in our Richmond office and a fantastic litigator who I work with all the time. And he specializes in consumer class actions with an emphasis on sales practices. Really pleased that Frank can join us as well. And then finally, last but not least, we have Allison Marr, who's an associate in our New York office. She's super knowledgeable about a wide variety of regulatory issues, including those related to FDA and food and beverage issues. So really glad she can join us as well. So here's our roadmap today. I'm going to kick it over to Katie Barber here in just a minute, who is going to give us the Supreme Court preview. Then we're going to flip it to Royce and Allison for the regulatory. Frank is going to handle sales practice litigation, and then I'm going to try to get through as much as I can of everything else, including trends, food labeling litigation, and product labeling litigation. So with, one other thing, we are trying, Halloween, of course, is our theme, and sort of general spookiness. So we're trying to keep with that theme, and you'll notice references to that throughout our presentation, as well as some cool art that we found to liven up our slides. So with that, let me turn it over to Katie.
Thanks, Trent. Happy to be back with you all again. Talking about it's already started, no longer upcoming. We're a month into the new October term 2025. It started on the first Monday of October is the official start of a new term. But I think one really notable aspect of going into this term is the fact that, it didn't really seem like the Supreme Court went away over the summer. Normally, you have a bit of a quiet summer. The justices go off on their boondoggles where they're teaching in Europe and having fun, writing books. And I think they were still doing that this summer, but they were, from Europe, they were deciding a lot of emergency applications. And so we call it what was once termed the shadow docket, I think no longer can really be called the shadow docket. It is not in the shadows anymore in any meaningful sense. It's now the proposed term is interim docket. Maybe I always knew it as the emergency docket. But I think Justice Kavanaugh said recently he thought interim was an appropriate term. So still kind of in flux what we call it. But it's basically the docket where the justices are asked to decide emergency motions on an expedited basis. Usually these motions are coming to the court as a lower court has, the typical posture right now is a lower court has enjoined a particular policy or action of the presidential administration. The administration then goes to the Supreme Court and asks for that lower court decision to be stayed or overturned. And these are meant to be kind of, they're decided on a bit of like a preliminary injunction kind of standard, and they are meant to be not decisions on the merits, but kind of these very fast moving, quickly decided decisions, whether to stay a lower court decision or release a stay is usually the posture in which they come up. I think what's notable about what's been happening, especially in the last 10 months or so, is just kind of the explosion of the docket, how many, the pace and frequency at which cases are being brought to this docket is already, double and far exceeding what was happening in the last few terms, where we already thought there was this huge growth of the emergency docket. Now there's just this explosion of it. You already have about as many emergency applications brought so far this year as you had total in the last 2 terms. And I think part of why you're seeing that is because there is a lot more going on in the lower courts. There's just a lot of this activity where you have a flurry of presidential actions happening in these first 10 months of the new administration. And there is a lot of litigation going on. And then some of that litigation is making its way to the Supreme Court. I think the current administration has been intentional about choosing what they pursue to the court. They're not challenging every lower court decision. They're kind of picking the ones that they think they will be the most successful on. And they seem to be predicting that correctly because they have had a lot of success in getting their emergency applications granted. Some of those applications have included immigration issues. Now we have, it continues. We've got right now on the emergency docket issues with the National Guard deployments to different cities and termination of federal grant funds. And then I think, as we'll talk about when I talk about a couple substantive cases, you're seeing some of these cases that are from the emergency interim docket making their way to the merits docket. Or at least making their way to getting oral argument and a little more time and consideration by the court, which is not kind of the typical way that these cases are handled. The other, I think, really kind of important aspect of what's going on with the emergency docket is this ongoing uncertainty and debate over just how precedential these decisions are and what lower court should be doing with them. Again, these are decisions that are often reached on a very short time frame, sometimes days, sometimes a couple weeks, and they are decided usually without extensive written opinions. So there will often be, the decision will be, maybe it's a paragraph, maybe it's a few pages, maybe there are a couple concurrences written. But in terms of the way merits, in contrast to how merits cases get decided, where you have often dozens and dozens of pages of opinion writing that the court has reached after months of deliberation, that is not how these cases get decided. And again, they're decided in this emergency posture where it's kind of about likelihood of success on the merits and harm, and not a full kind of decision of the real merits of the case, the real legal issues that are there. And so I think lower courts are struggling to know what some of these things mean, especially when they seem to be kind of either implicitly undermining or even overruling longstanding precedent. So I think 2 areas where we see that. One is in the federal grant funding area, where cases that have been brought to challenge funding terminations or funding decisions that I think people would have long thought you could bring under the Administrative Procedure Act are now getting kicked, saying that they should be brought under the Tucker Act in the Court of Federal Claims instead of a federal district Article 3 court. And that's all stemming from just a couple of per curiam Supreme Court orders on emergency cases. And so you're seeing kind of a lot of different outcomes in lower courts, uncertainty about how to approach that. Also, segueing into what we're going to talk about next, you have some of these decisions about the firing of agency heads that seem to be kind of overruling longstanding precedent on independent agency heads and what presidents can do with them. Now some of that's going to the merits docket, but there were already kind of these interim decisions made in a lot of contexts where a lot of these terminations took place that seem to be contrary to existing precedent and are issued without a lot of reasoning or explanation. So I think it's leaving a lot of litigants, a lot of lower courts in a bit of a muddle, and it continues to kind of just come at this really rapid fire pace too. So, the interim docket, I think now, at least so right now, is kind of as much of a thing to watch as the merits docket. But moving to the merits docket, I think another interesting aspect of this term is there are not a lot of, or really any, like traditional business litigation cases. There are no cases on the docket about arbitration. There aren't even really any like civil procedure questions or questions about class actions that you have historically seen at least a couple on the Supreme Court merits docket every term. This year's term, there's a lot of cases that are what you'd maybe term as more like culture war stuff. We've got cases on transgender rights and Voting Rights Act and a lot of these other kind of issues that, the court doesn't seem as interested this term in taking up kind of more traditional business cases. There's also a fair amount of criminal cases, which is also kind of unusual and maybe is balancing out the really contentious culture war cases. But I think the cases that are going to be most relevant to just the business and regulatory space for you all would be first these cases about the firing or about independent agency heads and to what extent those agency heads are independent anymore. So the main case, the first one that's going to come up is Trump v. Slaughter, which is involved a challenge to President Trump's firing of an FTC commissioner. There are, and again, this was one of like many of these cases that was coming up in the emergency docket, but this one, the court decided to have oral argument on the stay request and basically grant cert before judgment. And I think the reason they did that here is because this case is about the FTC commissioner, and the main precedent that involves that it will either get overturned or cabined in some way here is a case called Humphrey's Executor, which involved the FTC. And so it's kind of directly bringing to a head whether Humphrey's Executor still applies or applies in the way that it was held to back in 1935. Humphrey's Executor, I think fitting for our Halloween theme, has sometimes been referred to as a zombie precedent in recent years. Similar to how Chevron was before it got overturned. It's not necessarily a case that the Supreme Court has applied in recent times to constrain presidential power to remove agency heads, but it still has existed out there for close to a century. And the question basically is whether Humphrey's Executor what Humphrey's Executor said was that the FTC, at least at that time, was kind of a quasi-legislative, quasi-judicial body. It was not entirely an executive agency, and so it was appropriate for the FTC Act to constrain the president's power to remove FTC commissioners. The FTC Act currently says that those commissioners can only be removed for certain reasons, such as inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance, and that's similar again to kind of the Act's underlying or other sorts of executive agencies. And so the question is whether that constraint on the president's power to remove a commissioner is a violation of the separation of powers. And I think you're seeing here coming to a head this unitary executive theory that I think has long been espoused by some conservatives on the court and is certainly espoused by the current presidential administration, that you have a unitary executive who kind of is fulsome in his power. I think you're going to see in this case, I think you're going to see a win for the president saying that his power can't be constrained in this way. He basically has full authority to fire the FTC commissioner and heads of agencies that are similar to the FTC. I think the key thing that's going to happen is you have the Federal Reserve Board as this kind of outlier agency, different type of entity that the court, I think, wants to be careful to treat differently. And the court has already kind of indicated that it views the Federal Reserve to be something different than other types of executive agencies. And so the Supreme Court actually just at the beginning of this month agreed to hear another emergency docket case that deals with the firing of Federal Reserve Board member Lisa Cook. And I think the view is that the court's going to be very careful about how it kind of decides this Trump v. Slaughter case to make sure it also is balancing the Federal Reserve and is probably treating the Federal Reserve differently. It sees that as having, given the impact on economy and all of that, sees that as having kind of different import and wants to be careful about that. So we'll have to see how they walk that line. And second case, also about executive action. We have Learning Resources v. Trump, which is the tariffs case. This case involves the question of whether the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, allows the president to impose tariffs or impose tariffs of the kind that he has imposed. And this really is kind of a traditional statutory interpretation case. So it will be interesting to see how you have a lot of the Republican-appointed justices purport to be textualists and strict statutory constructionists. And this really is a question at base about whether IEPA's text, which says the president may regulate importation, whether that text allows a president to impose tariffs. And it has never been interpreted to allow that or disallow it. So this is a question of first impression and a situation of first impression. I think secondary to or informing the statutory construction questions are issues of the major questions doctrine. Basically, by using this language, did Congress intend to kind of grant discretion to the executive to do things like this? Is that an unconstitutional delegation of power? I think the president's side, the argument is, this is a foreign affair. This is about national security, foreign affairs, and you give the president great leeway in that area. And so you got to read the statute to allow this to happen, basically. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how the 6-member Republican appointed majority of the court kind of grapples with both those things, like their traditional impulse to be strict textualists, and then these ideas of giving the president broad power. And obviously, major implications either way of whether these tariffs stay in place or held to be, contrary to the statute. So it will be it's going to be a blockbuster term, and given the emergency docket there could be all kinds of new things that pop up between now and June. So a lot of interesting stuff to watch. Moving on to regulatory developments now.
Thank you, Katie. That was great. Looking forward to some real fun Supreme Court action again this year. So we're going to kick off a little bit with just some updates in the states as well as FDA. I'm going to kick it over to my colleague, Royce Dubonnet, in a few minutes to pick up where I leave off. So wanted to start off with California being added again. If you all remember where we left off last year, California's School Food Safety Act, which goes into effect officially 12/31/27, prohibits school districts from offering foods or beverages containing 6 colorings, blue 1, blue 2, green 3, red 40, yellow 5, yellow 6. And this sort of kicked off a big string of legislation in other states, which we'll talk about a little bit. But now California, just this month, I believe it was October 5th, governor signed into law California Bill 1264, banning ultra-processed foods of concern in schools. And this sort of tacks onto that Food Safety Act. And this is really the first legislation in the country to actually define ultra-processed food. FDA has been having several discussions about ultra-processed foods. It's a very high, did I freeze? It's it's of great interest to everybody, both FDA, healthcare, generally speaking, HHS, the new RFK, the head is, sorry, we're having some messages. Just want to make sure that everything's good. We're here. Okay. So California has taken the lead again in just trying to really get what California and some health advocates deem to be unhealthy foods out of the schools. So in addition to now the School Food Safety Act, we're talking about these ultra-processed foods of concern. So what does that mean? What is an ultra-processed food? Anything with surfactants in it, stabilizers or thickeners. Query whether that's going to include things like baking soda and other thickeners. Propellants, aerating agents, and gases, hence my photo of canned cheese. Not that I don't think that there's very many foods being sold in schools in a can or that have a gas contained in them, but I could be wrong. Colors and coloring adjuncts, emulsifiers, emulsifying salts, flavoring agents, and enhancers, except for naturally occurring spices and salt. However, there is sort of a limit on how much salt there can be in a food, and non-nutritive sweeteners. So the other factor that they're looking at in California is high amounts of saturated fat, sodium, or added sugar. And what does that mean? If 10% or greater of the total energy is from saturated fat or added sugars, and if your salt to calorie ratio is greater than 1:1. So Royce is going to talk in a few minutes about some federal MAHA focus on similar restrictions. So despite a little bit of differences between California and federal regulation, they're actually a little bit on the same page when it comes to healthy foods. So what is the ultra processed food of concern? So under the bill, the regulators in California are supposed to undergo a process of reviewing ingredients and reviewing foods sort of on a longer term basis. They have a few years to get to what they determine to be a UPF of concern. So it's sort of a TBD at this point. But the factors that they need to take into consideration are whether these substances or group of substances are banned in other jurisdictions, and that includes international. So they were going to see California looking to the EU in particular as far as what additives, what ingredients may be banned overseas for some guidance. Peer-reviewed literature, hence our friend Frankenstein here reading his scientific journal. But again, query with FDA's push against peer-reviewed literature and what really is a valid journal. I think there's going to be a little bit of dissonance between federal and California here as far as what counts as peer-reviewed literature. Whether products require a warning label in other jurisdictions, and there are some states that are looking at requiring warning labels for certain ingredients. Whether it may contribute to food addiction is also very interesting, or whether it's actually a highly palatable, it makes food highly palatable. So that's going to be really interesting to see where they come down as far as whether salt, because salt may make food more palatable, as will sugar, and sort of how they deal with that in addition to that limitation of the 1:1 ratio on the salt. Whether it's been modified to be high in added sugar, salt, or fat, and whether it meets the FDA definition of healthy, which we will talk about momentarily. So there is a significant amount of time before this is fully in effect. Schools are supposed to start phasing out these foods July of 29. So there is some time for California's Department of Health to really put a list together and figure out what it is that they determine to be a UPF of concern. And then we have until 2035 before all of these ingredients and foods have to be removed from schools in their entirety. So since last year we had 11 states who had introduced some type of food coloring ban on the heels of or in conjunction with the California Food Safety Act. A bunch of other states had jumped on the bandwagon. This year, 2025, we're up to 20 states. And those bans include either one of or multiple of the following ingredients, which if you've been attending these webinars over the past couple of years, you've heard these before. This is not new. Titanium dioxide, red 3, red 40, yellow number 4, yellow 6, blue 1, blue 2, green 3. These should sound familiar from California. BHA, azodicarbonamide, apologies, that's a big one, potassium bromate, BBO, and propylparaben. So we've got 20 states now that there's various legislation introduced. Some of these states, the legislation may have died already for those states that have part-time legislatures. So keep an eye out, but this is definitely a trend that more and more states are hopping on these bandwagons and maybe looking to ban certain ingredients, particularly dyes, going forward. So FDA updates on the dye front. We've got FD&C Red Number 3 authorization was officially revoked earlier this year. It had been, the petition for revocation had been out there since 2022. FDA had not taken swift action right before administration change. It was revoked. April 22nd, FDA initiates the process to revoke petroleum-based food colorings, Red 2 and Orange B. They're not officially revoked yet, but they've begun the process. On the flip side, in May, FDA approved 3 naturally occurring sources for food colorings: Gaulderia extract, which is a blue coloring, it's an algae; butterfly pea flower extract, which also causes deep blues and purples; and calcium phosphate, which is a white coloring. So there are some now naturally occurring dyes that FDA is trying to approve, and it feels like it's a little bit of a balance of we're taking some away, now we're giving you some new ones. So just recently in September, FDA formally proposed revoking Orange B in the Federal Register. Comments were open until just last week, so this is still pending final action. I think given the trend and given how FDA has been pushing to remove some of these chemicals, particularly the petroleum-based chemicals, from the food supply, I think I don't think it would be a far bet to assume that Orange B is probably next to come off the list. Earlier this year, FDA updated the healthy claim for foods, which is essentially requiring things that are fortified breads, fortified cereals, fortified juices are no longer considered to be healthy. The focus now is on natural foods, whole foods, things like fruits and vegetables, eggs, plain low-fat or no-fat yogurt, olive oil, salmon, healthy fats. And so some of those products that used to be able to bear a healthy label under the changes will no longer be able to bear the healthy label. And we expect to see enforcement not only from FDA, but obviously FTC, and likely an increase in claims from the National Advertising Division. We expect that there will probably be an uptick in competitors who may be trying to challenge some of these healthy claims. And then before I hand it over to my colleague Royce, we had some really interesting recalls this year. I thought this one was, and thanks to Gemini's image generator for the atomic prawn. I think this one made headlines, and it continues to make headlines. We keep having updates with respect to the shrimp that were contaminated with cesium-137. So radioactive shrimp, I don't think was on anybody's bingo card for the year, but here we are. FDA has now issued an import alert as well to stop the product from entering the country. And then we continue to see salmonella and listeria recalls in both human and pet food. Salmonella and listeria tend to be the 2 largest contaminants, 34 recalls involving salmonella and 36 this year involving listeria. So don't only check your candy bag, make sure if you're trick-or-treating and your kids get shrimp that you make sure that it's not glowing in the dark. So with that, I will pass it off to my colleague, Royce.
Hello, yes, this is not me in high school, although I can't say that my high school picture was much better. I was at my mom's house, and I was like, man, I didn't win any contests in high school. Okay, so Make America Healthy Again is really become more than just a political slogan. It's really has the ability to change the way FDA and the way consumers view food products that they purchase. And as we can see in California, it's being set up for a showdown between the states and the federal government on whose version and whose definition of processed food will prevail. It's not a single theme, but it hits most heavily on ingredients and nutrition content. We have at the federal level the complete 2026 dye elimination. And in May 15th, 2025, there's a proclamation by FDA that said that it wanted to introduce an evidence-based scheme for reviewing chemicals in foods. That's not incredibly different, in my opinion, than what we had before with the GRAS standard, generally recognized as safe because that was evidence-based as well. But new directions at FDA and new directions at Health and Human Services have decided to, again, revisit what does it mean to be safe as an ingredient in our food. So in keeping with that, it's kind of like opening the haunted box that isn't haunted. We're now going to revisit GRAS, and we're also going to revisit what it means for an ingredient to be safe. So a small guidance or a small, I wouldn't even call it a guidance, but notice in the Federal Register came out where FDA said tool for the prioritization of food chemicals for post-market assessment. They've decided that they're going to go with a multi-criteria decision analysis, an MCDA framework that will look at, the normal stuff, toxicity, exposure, vulnerable populations, and new science. Again, not really any different than what we were supposed to do under self-affirmation GRAS, which was essentially the process in which you brought a new food ingredient to market and sought FDA's input on commentary about whether or not that ingredient was safe. You usually try to get an FDA no comment letter and go about your life, but FDA is trying to formalize this despite there having already previously been a significant untackable backlog of GRAS petitions at FDA. But now FDA is adding in this other or wants to add in, if this becomes regulation, they want to add in a policy consideration which suggests that, not only can FDA consider the science, maybe the science is good and says that it's safe, but the FDA can also consider factors like loss of public confidence in the food supply, national attention of stakeholders. So essentially, FDA can take into account whether or not the ick factor will have, that was my timer, will have an ability to shape policy in a way that goes beyond the science. They're going to develop toxicity from a 9 to a 1, looking at bioaccumulation, reproductive toxicity, neurotoxicity, immunotoxicity. None of this is new in the way that we look at toxicity. So it's just new words, new branding, new approach with the added FDA may consider looking at the ick factor of the public. So as I said, this is just necromancery. This is a great movie, Pet Sematary, a great book too about a necromancer cat and other items in a burial ground in Maine. If you're interested in watching, it's very scary. The policy considerations are a key shift away from prior GRAS. GRAS self-review has always included hard scientific evaluation for toxicity. And, there's no real timeline or ability to address process by FDA, how they're going to do this, how long it's going to take, how many scientific reviewers they'll need. It's a lot of aspirational language. I would be stoked if it got done and it was part of FDA's agenda and they found the manpower, but we're currently in a shutdown, so not this week. School horrors, I gave my son a Kool-Aid the other day and my wife went crazy. And I told her, I was like, well, Kool-Aid is not the Kool-Aid that we used to have when we were kids, which was awesome. It got made healthy and it has a 75% reduction of sugar and it just doesn't taste great anymore. So it's, absent the dye considerations, it's not really that bad anymore. If you think comfort food has no place in the diet, but so given that, there's going to be some new dietary guidelines coming out specifically for schools, which are going to shape agenda and policy on how snack foods for kids are going to look. There's sodium reduction targets by 10% starting in 2027, new whole grain standards, removal of some minimal grain requirements in K-12, but they're going to be focusing more on nuts, seeds, beans, healthy fats, and proteins, and again, a reduction in added sugar. And what's interesting about all of these MAHA policies or healthier food policies is that there is considerable bipartisan support, and they cut both ways on the aisle again. So we are seeing a tectonic shift and headwinds in the comfort food, snack food industry and across all industries for consumers demanding healthier, more nutritious, less chemical food products. My personal opinion is that the more you get away, like there are some foods that are clearly processed, but there are also some chemicals and ingredients in foods to bring about safety and shelf stability. The more you reduce those sorts of known abilities to stabilize the food and keep it healthy, the more incidents of foodborne contamination illness you might have. So there's some good that comes from it, but there's also some careful food science considerations. I think a different standard is going to win out than what California has. I think the NOVA classifications, which essentially are used in Brazil for processed food, are going to win at the end of the day. I think when FDA under MAHA is looking for how do we define a processed food, I think the easiest framework that they can steal from is the NOVA classifications, which basically is grade 1 through 4, ultra processed, simple definition. Really can't make this at home. Some foods are going to have items that are industrial made. It's really the NOVA classification process is looking more at how is the food constructed and how is it made and what do you have to do to get it to that state of being than necessarily the ingredients in the food. NOVA does care about the ingredients in the food, but it's trying to define this mechanical irreparability at the home level as its definition of what a processed food is, because I think what NOVA's spirit is saying is that we cannot necessarily ascertain every single ingredient, but we can differentiate and bifurcate based on the way something is physically made, back to the word processed. And I am going to hand it off to Frank Talbot.
Thanks, Royce. Hey, everybody. Again, I'm Frank Talbot. I'm going to talk a little bit about updates in sales practices since our last webinar. Thank you all for joining. Today, I'll start with the negative option rule. As I discussed previously on a number of these, I believe, the FTC under the Biden administration had proposed the negative option rule, which was also known as the click to cancel rule. The basic idea was that when a company is offering subscription services, whether in a product or food and beverage or really any space to a consumer, that when a customer signs up, they should be able to unsubscribe in a manner that is just as easy as it is to sign up. And so the Biden administration proposed the rule, and it was set to go into effect this past summer. And essentially what it was going to do is if you signed up by email, you were supposed to be able to unsubscribe by email. Essentially, the goal was to mirror the subscription process with the unsubscription process. You couldn't allow consumers to sign up by email and then require them to call to unsubscribe, or then get sent around on the phone to 10 different people, because the idea is that consumers just give up. And you might think of it as being stuck in a haunted house and you just want to get out, and you're trying to just walk through the back door, but at every turn you're getting mirrors and people jumping out saying, "Are you sure you want to unsubscribe? Like, here's some more candy if you subscribe." And the FTC was trying to combat against that. So once it went into effect, there was a challenge by Custom Communications Group, and the Eighth Circuit this past summer vacated the rule on procedural grounds. The Eighth Circuit didn't actually get to the substance of the rule and whether it was appropriate. What happened was that there was an initial ALJ determination that the potential costs of implementing the rule on businesses throughout the country could exceed over $100 million. And that $100 million is a threshold that triggers some additional work by the FTC, where they have to put together a preliminary analysis and then offer it for public comment and allow the public to comment on it for a period before and consider the comments before ultimately adopting the rule. So the Eighth Circuit found that although that threshold was triggered, the FTC didn't actually do it. And so the Eighth Circuit vacated the rule. And since the change in administration, as I mentioned, it was initially proposed under the Biden administration, the Trump administration has not really signaled a desire to revise the rule, put it back into implementation. And so at least for now, it appears like the negative option rule is probably 6 feet under, at least for now. But that does not necessarily mean that subscription-based services are free to continue to trap people in the haunted house or attempt to. The FTC continues to have other statutory means to regulate these subscription-based services and programs, one of them being the Section 5 of the FTC Act, which is the general catch-all section that prohibits companies from behaving in potentially deceptive manner towards consumers. There is also the Restore Online Shoppers Confidence Act, which has a similar purpose and goal as Section 5 of the FTC Act that applies to online shopping, which is frankly where we see many sales practices, class actions and litigations occurring. And I don't think that should come as a surprise really to anyone, especially in the last decade as we've moved more online, and in the past 5 years, certainly, to being able to simply just order stuff from your phone or do it from your couch on your computer, and making it very easy. So the regulatory and enforcement framework has continued to try and catch up and keep up with that in preventing deception towards consumers. I wanted to highlight a couple of cases on these continued efforts to regulate. The FTC sued Uber Technologies earlier this year in the Northern District of California over Uber One subscriptions. The FTC had alleged that it's pretty easy for people to sign up for Uber One, which, speaking from experience, it is. You can just sort of click add it to your Uber app, and you see advertised discounts like, oh, you're saving X dollars with Uber One on this ride or on this order from your favorite restaurant. The FTC alleged that Uber was promising savings of $25 per month for using their app, but that was false. They also sued, claiming that to, quote, normally unsubscribe from Uber One, and a consumer had to take at least 12 different actions to unsubscribe, which is quite different than the sort of easy one-click sign up. And the FTC argues that Uber makes it even worse if you're within 2 days of your billing cycle by saying that a consumer has to take at least 32 different actions on over 20 different screens to unsubscribe. Uber obviously disputes all that and claims that It's a very low percentage of people who actually accidentally sign up and don't want to continue. But again, it's an effort to enforce these subscription-based services and practices related to them outside of the now gone negative option rule. And many of y'all might have seen that recently the FTC and Amazon were engaged in significant litigation and actually went to trial in September for at least a couple of days over Amazon Prime subscription services. The claims were brought under ROSCA, again, outside of the click to cancel rule. And essentially the FTC argued that Amazon didn't properly disclose the terms for Prime, didn't get consent before changing the terms, and didn't offer a simple cancellation. Part of the evidence that the FTC put on was that there were internal communications at Amazon where individuals recognized that people might have a hard time unsubscribing from Amazon Prime. They even called it an Iliad loop, to where a consumer really just couldn't unsubscribe. Obviously, Amazon, like Uber, disputed this, but ultimately, after a couple days of trial, Amazon settled for $2.5 billion, with $1 billion being civil penalties and $1.5 billion to go to consumers. But again, it highlights that just because the click to cancel rule isn't here doesn't mean that there is any less risk from companies having subscription-based services that might be viewed as deceptive and keeping individuals in the subscription services where they have signed up for them. So we've seen a significant uptick in pricing litigation. As we've talked about on a number of these webinars, there are various state laws regarding pricing. For example, California has a discount pricing rule that says that you can't advertise for a lower strike-through price. A lower price based on a strike-through price if the strike-through price wasn't the bona fide price that was offered for sale within the previous 90 days. Essentially, it wants to prevent companies from putting a product or a service on the market and then just having a struck-through price and advertising it for $50 when it was struck through at $100, when it hadn't sold the product for $100 for years, because the idea is that that's really a false price because you haven't sold it for that for a long time. There have been some external factors, I think, that have led to this. One of them is inflation. And so both consumers and state AGs and the federal government have scrutinized pricing a little bit more as it relates to consumers because of the effect it has on them. There's also tariffs, which have had an economic effect. And so prices going up, trying to make sure that companies are, if they are going to pass on the tariffs, are doing it appropriately and in a manner that discloses it appropriately to the consumer before they buy. And so as part of the pricing litigation, we've seen a number of hidden fee litigations. Think of it as the nefarious teenagers hiding in the bushes, just waiting for you on Halloween to go back inside so they can toilet paper your house. And we've seen a number of these in live event space. I know that's not food and beverage, but those tend to be big. And so here we have the Live Nation and Ticketmaster cases where essentially the argument is that individuals thought they were buying a ticket to a live event for X number of dollars, and then they get to the end of the transaction and they're about to check out, and then it's thrust upon them that there's like a 50% service fee. And that's similar to the Shake Shack case where Shake Shack consumers have sued saying, hey, we were going to order our food from Shake Shack, but then at the end of the process, it has a delivery fee and a convenience fee that were never disclosed. And so while we thought we were spending $25 to order our food, it's actually going to cost us $45. And that's, quote, deceptive because it was never disclosed at the beginning. And I'll just note that there are a number of state laws, they're varied across the country, but there are a number of state laws that have been enacted in recent years that require companies to disclose those fees up front. And so when you are advertising the price, you need to disclose, like, yeah, it might be $25, but there's a $4 service fee, there's a $5 convenience fee. So your actual price at the beginning, the actual price is going to be like $34, and that needs to be disclosed up front and not at the end after the consumer has done all the work to go through the process. And then finally, one of the things that we have talked about on these in terms of risk mitigation are the inclusion of arbitration clauses in terms and conditions for companies. And there have been a number of recent cases, but two I wanted to highlight. The Davidashvili case against Grubhub was an antitrust case that was brought, and it involved Grubhub and Uber Eats and Postmates. And the Second Circuit did a good job of sort of walking through the various arbitration agreements and the processes by which consumers were alleged to have agreed to them. One of the things that differentiated Grubhub and Uber's and Postmates was Grubhub didn't contain a delegation clause, and a delegation clause being a clause that says, you agree that any dispute about whether this arbitration clause actually applies or is enforceable is decided by the arbitrator. And so with the delegation clause, it keeps it, the court doesn't need to reach a bunch of stuff and can just send it to arbitration. And if the arbitrator says, actually, it's not covered, then the case can start over. Uber Eats and Postmates, on the other hand, did have those. And so Grubhub then had to go through the process of having its process looked at to see whether the arbitration clause was actually applicable. And the court found it was not, because even though the terms and conditions said that any dispute arising out of our contractual relationship is subject to arbitration, the court said all disputes arising out of does not mean necessarily any and all and every dispute, because the anti-competitive conduct that was alleged could have damaged people who did not agree to the terms and conditions, and there was a greater effect. So companies just need to remember to be very specific when presenting these and use specific language when doing so. And then finally, the Jill acquisition case, just one little piece of California law where we see a bunch of these. One of the things that courts look at is whether a consumer anticipated an ongoing relationship or whether it was just like a one-time purchase. So this individual had used guest checkout, and the terms and conditions were fairly disclosed, but the individual didn't envision some ongoing relationship with Jill acquisition. And so the court said, well, we're not going to enforce it because there was no expectation that, you're making a one-time purchase, that this long terms and conditions would actually apply. And the way to sort of and contrast that with a subscription base where it's like, hey, you're getting regular products, you have this ongoing relationship, of course you would think terms and conditions would apply. And you think of it sort of as a kid who's trick-or-treating, who's just going to a house and they think they're getting a king size bar, but they get a regular size. And then, they think it's completely unfair that they didn't get the king size bar, even though they got a free candy bar. But they're not going to go back to the house and complain about it because there's no thought of ongoing relationship there. So anyway, those are the sort of quick updates. And now I will pass it along to Trent for the last couple of minutes.
Yes, thank you, Frank. I appreciate it. So we may run maybe 5 minutes over. I'm going to try to move through my slides fast. I'm going to start with some trends that we've seen. There's been a lot of cases over the last few years related to lead and heavy metals in a variety of products. It's maybe started with baby formula, baby food, but now has moved to a number of other products. And there was a consumer reports investigation just a couple of weeks ago that found, and they basically did testing of a bunch of protein supplements, and they found lead and heavy metals in a number of those supplements. That has led to several cases filed in just the last couple of weeks. The first one on this slide, and then the third one have both been filed in the last 10 days. And that's just a reminder that investigations by things like Consumer Reports or other nonprofits where they do testing lots of times leads to a flurry of lawsuits. We also have the second one here, which involved children's toothpaste that allegedly contained double the federal limit on lead, and that's more of a health halo claim there, saying that you wouldn't think it would have lead in it because of the packaging and that it's marketed to children, that kind of thing. But when they did testing with an independent lab, they found that it did. One other thing, and then of course the fourth one here relates to rice. Class action filed a few months ago related to a number of brands of rice sold by Amazon that allegedly contained heavy metals. And that also was precipitated by a nonprofit lab testing that then published the results. The last one I wanted to note real quick also involved lead levels in tampons, but there, interestingly, the court denied a motion to dismiss and found that while the plaintiff did not allege that she tested the products that she bought, it said that she didn't need to, given that she alleges the products are identical across the different packages. And we're going to contrast that to some of the cases on this slide, which involves PFAS. There continues to be a number of cases involving PFAS. And here are a few examples of those. Those have not had much luck. And there was a big case just in the last month, the top one here, Labyrinths v. Coca-Cola, where the court dismissed the class action against Coca-Cola, alleging that it actually involved orange juice. And the allegation was that the juices contained PFAS, and they had lab testing, but they did not establish that the actual products that the plaintiff purchased had PFAS. So that contrasts with the case on the last slide. And there have been several other cases that have reached the same conclusion, including the Peterson case. So PFAS continues to be a trend that we're seeing with lawsuits filed based on that. Greenwashing is another one. Obviously, this is something we've talked about on just about every one of these webinars we've done in the past, but it continues to evolve, right? So the first one involves carbon neutral vape. And the allegation was that, that it's not carbon neutral. They haven't substantiated the fact that it is carbon neutral. And there's a motion to dismiss pending in that case. And then the last three on here relate to recyclable. And there have been a number of suits filed by interest groups like the Sierra Club, as well as state and local municipalities. And there's also the plaintiff's bar has been active as well. And so they have filed suit recently. So the California AG filed suit just a couple of weeks ago, and then the city of Philadelphia did about a month ago, claiming that the bags are not recyclable, even though they are claimed to be. So, the takeaway there is if you are claiming that your product is recyclable or biodegradable, then you need to engage in an analysis and make sure that it is substantiated 6 ways to Sunday. There continue to be a number of other lawsuits and class actions related to other types of environmental claims, such as bio-based, climate pledge friendly. And I'm not going to have time to go through all of these, and we'll obviously get to the slides after this so that you can review some of these bullets and even look at the cases later if you so choose. But, the bottom line is there is still quite a bit of greenwashing class actions that are being filed and litigated. Here's another one, and this dovetails with some of the things that Royce and Allison were talking about. This top one in particular, which relates to ultra-processed foods. And so there is a concerted effort now by the plaintiffs' bar to once again go after unhealthy food like ultra-processed food, claiming that it's addictive, claiming that it causes health problems. This Martinez case was filed in December. It was removed, and then briefing on the motion to dismiss, and the motion to dismiss was ultimately granted back in August in a personal injury suit. But this is not the last that we're going to see of this. I know for a fact there's a number of prominent members of the plaintiffs' bar that continue to advertise and look for plaintiffs to bring this litigation. So be aware there's going to be more of these suits going forward, and they're continuing to try to push this forward, even though they have not had much success in this type of suit going back decades. All right, quickly, just want to highlight a few categories of cases. No artificial flavors cases, continues to be quite a few of these against mainly snack foods and drinks. And the claim there is that they claim there's no artificial colors, flavors, preservatives, but they contain citric acid. These are not new cases, but they continue to be filed. Protein cases. There's also a fair number of protein cases that continue to be filed out there. And you know, one of the things that's sort of interesting that with this top one that was recently filed is it's more of a health halo claim. It's not saying that the protein claim itself is wrong, but it's saying that it emphasized protein in the advertising, but it actually has other unhealthy things like sugar in it, and therefore it's deceptive for that reason. So that's a little bit of a slight sort of change in those types of protein cases. Caffeine continues to be something that we see some class actions on. Here's one where the court dismissed a class action alleging that Logan Paul's Prime Hydration energy drink misled consumers by containing more caffeine than advertised. And the court there found, hey, that's what the consumers want. The reason they're buying this is because it has more caffeine in it. Just because it has a little more than what is on the label of the can is not deceptive to people. Probiotics is something where there's been there continues to be some litigation related to probiotics. So that's something else to keep in mind. This is another case involving climate neutral for Cliff Kid Z bars. And here the court found that there was a distinction between a claim that it was climate neutral certified versus being climate neutral. And therefore the court granted the motion to dismiss here. But claims like climate neutral continue to be targeted in litigation, just like the other greenwashing cases that I mentioned earlier. Here's a fun one involving malt beverage. And the court granted class certification in this case, alleging that the defendant misleadingly labeled malt beverage products that led consumers to believe they contained distilled spirits. Here are the two products. One, the one on the left does not say whiskey. The one on the right does say whiskey, and there's a difference in the alcohol volume, and that's what the basis of that particular lawsuit was. There continue to be contamination cases, but no real surprise there. There was one other thing I wanted to flag. This is a fun Halloween case. The allegation in this class action related to the actual candy was not as pretty as the one on the label. Now, the judge dismissed this case, saying that the plaintiffs didn't allege that there was really anything wrong with the product. And it actually did have a similar shape to the pumpkin on the package. Now, it didn't have the jack-o'-lantern carvings there, but maybe that's something that consumers can do on their own, perhaps with their teeth or with a fork. But in any event, the court dismissed that one. The only other thing I wanted to hit real quick was this one. And this goes to some of the Maha stuff that Royce and Allison were talking about. You all probably saw in the news, this got quite a bit of attention, that the Texas AG filed a suit against Tylenol's maker, claiming that they are hiding the risk that the product can lead to autism. And this is based on some of the findings that the current administration has made related to this. And so I think, we'll obviously watch this and we'll report back on it, but this kind of thing is happening more and more often. There's a political angle to everything these days. And I think we're seeing state AGs become more active, and we're seeing, becoming more active, trying to enact the MAHA agenda. And so that's going to create a lot of headaches for companies in this space. And that's something to obviously think about. I know everyone probably is thinking about that, but if you need help navigating some of those, we'll be more than happy to help, but that there's a political angle in addition to a regulatory angle. So with that, I am going to stop for now. If folks have questions, feel free to email or call us. We love talking about this stuff. And thank you so much for joining us. And we'll make sure everybody gets a copy of these slides going forward. Thank you so much. That concludes our program.